The first truck arrived before sunrise. Ethan Carter heard the brakes from his bedroom window and thought somebody had missed the county road. Then came the second truck. And the third. By the time he pulled on his boots and stepped onto the porch, headlights stretched along the gravel lane behind his property like a convoy. His father was already outside. Walter Carter stood near the fence line wearing an old brown coat over his overalls, coffee steaming in one hand, while dump trucks backed toward the far edge of the back pasture. Ethan frowned. What's going on? Walter watched the first trailer rise. Sawmill's got waste problems. A mountain of pale sawdust poured onto the frozen ground behind the fence. Steam rose from it in the cold morning air. Ethan stared. They're dumping that here. Walter nodded once. Temporary arrangement. How temporary? Walter sipped his coffee. Depends how much they pay. That was 1979, and by the end of winter, the backfield looked buried in snow that smelled like pine. The Carter farm sat outside a lumber town in northern Wisconsin where nearly everybody depended on the mill one way or another. When production increased, waste increased with it. Sawdust, wood chips, shavings, mountains of it. Most farms wanted nothing to do with it. Too acidic, too unstable. Too much mess. But Walter Carter had lost half his hay crop the previous drought year, and the mill offered cash for dumping rights on unused ground behind the pasture fence. Cash mattered, especially when machinery repairs didn't care about weather. The neighbors laughed immediately. Dale Harper leaned against his pickup, watching another load unload one afternoon. Congratulations, he called out. You're officially farming hamster bedding. Walter ignored him. Rick Harlow laughed harder. That field's ruined forever. Walter finally answered while checking fence wire. Then good thing it wasn't yours. That shut them up temporarily. Not permanently. Nothing stopped rural mockery permanently. The dumping continued for years. Spring, summer, winter. Truck after truck backing into the same low field behind the fence line. By 1982, the piles stood taller than Ethan. By 1984, they looked like rolling hills of pale gold stretching across acres. Children called it the wooden desert. People driving the county road slowed down just to stare. One man at the feed store asked Walter if he planned on opening a horse stable big enough to justify that much bedding. Walter simply said, "Not everything useful looks useful immediately." Ethan remembered that sentence because at the time, even he wasn't convinced. The sawdust caused problems early. Wind carried fine particles across nearby fields. Rain compacted sections into sour-smelling mats. One pile actually heated internally enough to smoke during wet summer weather. Dale drove out specifically to enjoy that. Your dirt's on fire now. Walter stood beside the steaming pile calmly. No. What? Compost is. That confused Dale enough to irritate him. The truth was stranger than anyone realized. Walter wasn't just letting the mill dump waste. He was experimenting. Quietly. Every few weeks, he mixed manure into selected piles. Then old hay. Then lime. Then poultry litter bought cheap from a neighboring county. He tracked temperatures with a metal probe thermometer and kept notes in weathered notebooks at the kitchen table late into the night. Ethan asked him once why he bothered. Walter looked up from the notebook. Because soil's hungry. That doesn't mean anything. It means dirt's alive whether people respect it or not. At 15, Ethan thought that sounded ridiculous. At 35, he would repeat it word for word. By 1985, the backfield smelled different. Less like raw sawdust. More earthy. Rich. The oldest piles darkened from pale yellow into deep brown-black mounds steaming softly during cool mornings. Walter spread test sections across exhausted ground near the south field where corn yields had struggled for years. The results weren't dramatic immediately, but they were noticeable. Moisture held longer. Crusting reduced. Earthworms returned thick after rain. Walter said almost nothing publicly about it. That was intentional. People argue harder against ideas than results. The first real sign came during the drought of 1986. Rain disappeared across much of northern Wisconsin by mid-July. Pastures browned early. Corn curled under heat. Topsoil hardened into cracked plates across half the county. But the south field held green longer. Not perfect, but better. Dale noticed first while standing beside the road one August evening. That section yours? Walter nodded. Dale looked again. Why is it greener? Walter rested his arms on the fence. Better soil. Dale snorted. From tree dust. Walter smiled faintly. From carbon. That answer spread through town because nobody understood it. Back then, most farmers thought organic matter was something you tolerated, not managed strategically. Walter thought differently. The mill kept dumping, and Walter kept building. By 1988, the waste field had become something enormous. Layer after layer of decomposing organic material transformed into dark compost rich enough to stain boots black. Walter bought an old spreader wagon specifically to handle it. Neighbors laughed less now, mostly because yields were changing. The Carter fields stopped drying out as fast. Soybeans emerged more evenly. Hayfields thickened. Even bad sections improved. Rick Harlow cornered Walter outside the feed store one morning. "You really making dirt out of sawdust?" Walter shrugged. "More or less." Rick frowned. "That shouldn't work." Walter loaded feed sacks into the truck. "Neither should farming half the things we do." The real turning point came in 1989. The lumber mill changed ownership. New management arrived. And suddenly the dumping agreements became a problem. Corporate inspectors visited the Carter property with clipboards and concerned expressions. One man in polished boots stared across the massive compost field. "How much material is out here?" Walter answered calmly. "About 10 years." The inspectors didn't laugh like locals did. They looked nervous. Because environmental regulations were changing, and what once counted as harmless disposal now carried liability risks. 3 weeks later, Walter received a formal notice. The mill intended to terminate dumping and potentially reclaim portions of the waste field. Ethan found his father reading the letters silently at the kitchen table. "They can do that." Walter folded the paper carefully. "They think they can." Outside the window, the old sawdust hills stretched across the back acreage, glowing gold beneath evening sunlight. Not waste anymore. Not even close. Walter looked back toward the field quietly, then smiled slightly for the first time all day. "Good," he said. Ethan frowned. "Good." Walter tapped the letter. They finally realized it's worth something. And by the next spring, half the county would realize it too. The mill's lawyers arrived in April. 3 black sedans rolled slowly down the Carter driveway, while Ethan repaired fencing near the machine shed. Men in pressed shirts stepped out carrying folders thick enough to matter. Walter watched from the porch without moving. "That them?" Ethan asked. Walter nodded once. They finally smelled money. The lead attorney introduced himself politely, which Walter mistrusted immediately. People with leverage rarely start polite unless they need something. They walked the back field together beneath cold spring wind. The old sawdust piles no longer looked like waste dumps. They looked like rich black earth stretching across acres. Grass grew thicker there than anywhere else on the property. The attorney stopped beside one dark compost ridge and scraped the soil with his shoe. "This material originated from mill operations," he said carefully. Walter looked across the field. "No." The man frowned. "Our records show the company deposited wood waste here for over a decade." Walter knelt and grabbed a handful of black soil. "This isn't wood waste anymore." He let the soil fall slowly through his fingers. "This is compost." The attorney exchanged a look with the others. "We believe portions of the material may remain recoverable company assets." Ethan almost laughed at that. Recoverable assets. 10 years earlier, the mill had paid Walter to take it because nobody else wanted the problem. Now the same piles were producing better yields than half the county. Funny how value changes memory. Walter stood slowly. "You abandoned it here. It was stored here. It rotted here." The attorney adjusted his tie. "The company would prefer an amicable resolution." Walter nodded. "So would I." That meeting ended without agreement. 3 weeks later, county officials appeared, then environmental consultants, then state agriculture representatives. Because once lawyers get involved, everyone suddenly becomes very interested in dirt. The mill argued the compost piles still belonged to them as industrial byproducts. Walter argued they had become transformed agricultural soil amendments through years of labor and management. The county mostly argued over paperwork. Meanwhile, spring planting started, and the Carter fields looked unbelievable. The South corn field emerged dark green and uniform, while neighboring ground struggled through cold rain and compacted soil. Moisture held deeper. Root development accelerated. People noticed, especially Dale Harper. He stood at the edge of the field one evening, shaking his head slowly. "I farmed next to this place 20 years. Walter adjusted the spreader wagon nearby. I remember when that dirt couldn't grow decent hay." Walter nodded. Dale looked across the rich black soil. "And now this looks like Iowa." Walter finally glanced at him. Compost helps. Dale laughed quietly. You're enjoying this way too much. Walter smiled slightly. A little. By midsummer, rumors spread faster than facts. Some people said the mill planned lawsuits. Others claimed the state would shut the operation down entirely. But the crops kept growing. That was the problem. Results are hard to argue with once they become visible from the road. Then came August, and the university. A soil science team from Madison arrived after hearing about Walter's fields through state agriculture offices. They spent 2 full days taking samples, measuring organic matter levels, and testing water retention. The lead researcher looked stunned by the numbers. You built this from sawdust. Walter shrugged. And manure. The researcher knelt, grabbing another handful of soil. This organic content is extraordinary. Dale Harper overheard that while pretending not to listen nearby. Extraordinary. Nobody had ever used that word for Carter ground before. The university report changed everything. The compost fields showed dramatically improved microbial activity, water retention, and long-term fertility potential compared to surrounding exhausted farmland. The report used words the county had never attached to Walter Carter before. Innovative, sustainable, regenerative. The newspaper ran the story 2 weeks later. Front page. Picture included. Walter hated that. Ethan loved it. The headline read, "Local farmer turns sawmill waste into high-yield soil system." By then the mill had a bigger problem than compost ownership. Public relations. Because suddenly the story wasn't about industrial waste anymore. It was about a farmer transforming discarded material into productive farmland. The company looked less like a victim and more like people trying to reclaim dirt they once paid someone else to haul away. Grant Mercer himself finally visited that autumn. New regional manager. Clean boots. Expensive coat. Corporate smile. He walked the field slowly beside Walter while combines rolled through the distance. The company is willing to settle ownership disputes, Grant said carefully. Walter looked across the harvest. You mean lose quietly? Grant ignored that. We may also be interested in future partnerships. That almost made Ethan choke laughing from the tractor cab nearby. 10 years earlier the mill dumped waste because nobody valued it. Now they wanted partnerships. Walter folded his arms. What kind? Grant gestured toward the fields. Commercial compost processing. Agricultural distribution. Regional expansion. Walter stared at him a long moment. Then asked the question that mattered. Why? Grant looked genuinely confused. Because this has value. Walter nodded slowly. That's the first honest thing your company's said about this land. The final settlement came before winter. The mill dropped ownership claims entirely in exchange for future supply agreements and limited compost processing rights. Walter kept the land. And the soil. That part mattered most. By 1991, neighboring farmers started copying parts of a system. Not all of it. Most lacked the patience, or the space, or Walter's willingness to spend years looking foolish. But compost piles appeared across the county after that. Organic matter became a real conversation instead of hippie nonsense. Even Dale Harper started spreading manure differently. He hated admitting where the idea came from. One cold November evening, Ethan stood beside Walter overlooking the old, waste field, glowing black beneath sunset light. The same place people once mocked for looking ruined. Now it produced some of the best soil in the region. You know, Ethan said, they really thought the mill destroyed this land. Walter nodded. Most people confuse change with damage. Wind moved softly across the dark fields. Rich. Alive. Nothing like the dead ground buried beneath sawdust years earlier. Ethan looked out across the endless black soil. When did you know it would work? Walter considered the question a while, then answered honestly. I didn't. Ethan frowned. Then why keep going? Walter smiled faintly. Because soil's hungry. The same words Ethan once thought sounded ridiculous. Now they sounded like truth. For years, the mill dumped sawdust behind Walter Carter's fence because nobody else wanted it. Then the old farmer turned every pile into the richest soil around. And by the time the company realized what they'd thrown away, it no longer belonged to them.